Koutou katoa. Nau mai haere mai ki te koutou ko te mana whenua o Ngāi Huriri, koutou ko Ngāi Tahu Whānui, tēnā koutou. Ki era atu o ngā matawaka, ngā uri o ngā hoiwha, e hui mai nei e tēnei pō. He mihi araha tēnā ki a koutou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you everyone for being here this evening. I'm Jessica Halliday, the Director of Te Pūtahi Centre for Architecture and City Making, and it is indeed a pleasure to have you all here for the first He Whakawhiti Kōrero Christchurch Conversations this year, which is titled Urban Heat. Before we begin, I would like to thank our supporters and acknowledge the organisations that make these events possible. This year, He Whakawhiti Kōrero Christchurch Conversations enjoys the support of the Christchurch City Council through the Sustainability Fund, as well as the support of the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO. We thank them both for making this year's series of conversations possible. Now, we might be all enjoying this typically cool August evening here in Ōtautahi, that very brisk. Is it a southerly tonight? Well and truly. But tonight's topic is not cool at all. In fact, it's hot. This year, the effects of climate breakdown are really making climate change more tangible around the globe. Recently, I'm sure you've been watching too, Western Europe experience its biggest heat wave in recorded history. It has resulted in dried up rivers, approximately 20,000 deaths, and 90,000 hectares burnt by wildfires in France alone. The ground is parched, consistent with widespread water stress, which will hit the agriculture industry and food production. Critical infrastructure has been shut down. An estimated 180 billion euros could be wiped off the EU GDP by the heat waves, and in the UK the heat wave is estimated to have cost the economy £4.4 billion already. Now, sorry to kick off with something so depressing, but we already know about heat and about low soil moisture. If you are familiar with Canterbury and its landscape, yes, it will be a problem, and it has been a problem, and will be a greater problem for food production here in Waitaha. But you'll hear tonight from speakers who will also make it clear to us that increasing heat, is a concern for an urban centre like ours as well. Tonight, our speakers will introduce why increasing urban heat from climate change matters here in Ōtautahi. They will explain the risks and explore what we can do to mitigate urban heat to ensure a more livable city for all. While other adaptation strategies will be touched on tonight, tonight's conversation will primarily focus on the vital role trees play in mitigating urban heat. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to share two things we've learnt through Christchurch Conversations over the years. Adaptation to urban heat by planting trees does not mean that we can neglect the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Nor are we advocating for trees as a means of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. Offsetting climate emissions by planting trees is a delusion. Yes, plant trees, but not because you're expecting to offset emissions. And if you want to know why, please watch a previous Christchurch Conversations event from 4 years ago. It's called Can Christchurch Plant Its Way Out of Climate Change? And the answer was no, but plant trees. You'll hear that theme again tonight. You can find that conversation on our YouTube channel alongside a heap of others from the past 5 years. There's a heap to learn there, just as there will be a lot to learn tonight to apply to our thinking and to our actions. So just to briefly outline this evening, first up we'll have two brief presentations, which will be followed by the bulk of the evening, which is a panel discussion of around 45 minutes. We'll then round out the evening with a poetry reading. Whether you're attending this event online or if you're in the room, you can ask the panel questions by texting your question to 022 565 8693. So don't feel you have to record the number now because this slide will be on the screen during the Q&A. Kia ora to our online audience. You also have the option to ask questions via the chat function on YouTube if you wish, or to text it in. And questions from everyone will be conveyed to the panel by myself and by Emma up the back. Apologies in advance, there's every chance we won't be able to put all your questions to the panel, but we'll do what we can. And now to introduce our first two speakers, who I'm going to introduce together. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Rebecca Peer, who will be talking about what urban heat is and why we should care about it. Dr. Peer is a senior lecturer and associate head of the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at the University of Canterbury. She established and co-leads the Sustainable Energy Research Group, where she leads research at the intersection of energy systems and climate change. She holds a PhD in engineering from the University of Southern California. Following Rebecca is Toby Chapman, the Urban Forest Manager for Christchurch City Council. Toby leads the Council's arboricultural team within the Parks Division. Since joining the Council 10 years ago, he has been involved with the writing and adoption of both Council's tree policy and also the urban forest plan. Tonight he'll talk about creating and mapping an urban forest. But first, please welcome Dr. Rebecca Peer to the stage.
Okay, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And thank you for setting the scene. And most importantly, thank you everyone for having me and for listening to me at this Christchurch Conversations. So as was introduced, my name is Rebecca Peer. I do work at the University of Canterbury and I am an engineer, which we won't say too loudly, but I am an engineer, but I care deeply about climate and about sustainability. So I was very honored when Emma reached out to me to ask if I might be interested in joining this conversation. So it's my job to do a short introduction for everyone, emphasis on the short introduction. And so the very first question that we must ask ourselves then in this conversation is, what is urban heat? Why are we all here to talk about this? Well, some of you in the crowd might have an idea already of what urban heat is. Another word for this concept of urban heat is the urban heat island effect. So maybe some of you have read about this or heard about it in the news, the urban heat island. And that happens when areas with lots of built-up infrastructure, think roads and parking lots and buildings, particularly in a really dense setting with low green space, all congregate together, and that creates a warming effect. It's hotter than it would be otherwise. And that's what causes this urban heat or this urban heat island effect. So it's really the effect of changing what was there before, or the environment that was there before, with things like roads and buildings and basically everything that helps us live in society. And because we've been decreasing what is usually naturally green space and increasing things like our dark, impervious surfaces, right, particularly around our city, that creates an overall warming or heating effect. All those dark, built-up surfaces, roads and car parks and buildings, concrete and asphalt, right? Those can trap more heat than our natural environment can. And they don't breathe quite like green space or quite like trees, right? And so they make that environment quite hot. And the heating effect that we feel in cities is obviously pronounced during the day when the sun is out and it's quite warm. We can feel that when we're in a built environment. But one of the most significant impacts for urban heat and the urban heat island effect is actually overnight. So during the nighttime in an urban heat environment, all of that asphalt, all of that built-up environment retains heat, and we actually don't get as much evaporative cooling overnight as we would otherwise. So when the sun goes down and we're experiencing a time of really extreme heat, we get little or less relief inside of a city than we would, for example, in a rural environment. And so really high temperatures can persist throughout the night, and it can feel quite hot for a really long time. You may have seen lots of links to urban heat recently with the news. Jessica mentioned it in her opening, the heat waves that we've been experiencing in Europe. And that is certainly exacerbated within the cities and within city centers. And many of these very dense cities in Europe and across the UK would be experiencing temperatures that are 5, sometimes as high as 8 degrees hotter within the city than it would be outside of the city, purely because of this urban heat effect. And so that heat wave that they've been experiencing is even more pronounced inside of the city. And that increased heat in cities can be really impactful. Jessica touched on some of those health impacts. It's not only health, but it's also our environment, right? Our water resources, our ecosystems, our natural environment that gets impacted by this urban heat effect. And this is especially true for our most vulnerable populations and our most vulnerable ecosystems. It's also true that our most vulnerable populations will experience the highest impacts from urban heat. So those who are in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, any cities that are in that area, right? Very, very hot and will be increasingly hot with a changing climate. A study published last year found that even in New Zealand, we found that 500 children are hospitalized in New Zealand each year for heat-related impacts. So even though it's not that hot here in New Zealand today, we still experience those heat-related issues. Perhaps not as pronounced as the hundreds and thousands of people that would have felt it across Western Europe these last few months, but we do still feel the impacts of urban heat here in New Zealand. Indirectly, we may also experience some impacts like increased energy use. As it gets hotter outside, we may want to cool our homes and our offices more and more. This would be a new energy demand for us here in New Zealand. It's not typically something that we do. We're used to days like today or maybe last week when it's cold outside in the winter. That's when we use most of our energy to keep ourselves warm. And so switching into this new environment where we have more and more hotter days would potentially create a new energy demand. Now, while climate change is not responsible for this urban heat effect or this urban heat island, it is an exacerbator. And so when we think about that urban heat island effect, climate change acts as something that can amplify it, right? And so the way we design our cities is really what designates how much heat we feel in an urban environment. But as our global average temperatures rise from climate change, and we may see an increase in extremes like extreme heat, we can expect that urban heat island effect to get worse. Beyond increasing greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously increase or contribute to climate change, we also have things like air pollution from particulate matter, which can make that urban heat impact feel worse. For Christchurch, climate experts estimate that hot days, which we designate here in New Zealand as days above 25 degrees Celsius, which is hot for us in New Zealand, they estimate that here in Christchurch, we might experience somewhere between 32 and 64 days a year above 25 degrees Celsius. Non-specific, so that temperature could be in the 30 degrees, or it could be just above 25 degrees. And they would expect even more than that by the end of the century as we predict those climate change impacts to take effect. Well, there's relatively little research on the urban heat effect of Christchurch itself. The very little work that has been done suggests that even within Christchurch, we experience an urban heat island effect that's somewhere between 1 to 4 degrees on average. And because we're very sensitive to wind and weather effects here, it does depend how the wind blows and what the weather's doing outside. So you might be asking now, what do we do about this urban heat effect? Well, there's great news. There are some options for us to consider. Jessica obviously introduced primarily among them is obviously thinking about mitigation. And so that is one option to think about the persistent heat impacts, those slow climb of global temperature increase in order to deal with climate change. But how do we adapt in a city that we know is going to face these urban heat impacts despite our best efforts in mitigating climate change? There are options for our built infrastructure, right? Where we live and how we work and where we work. And those include things like cool roofs. So those are roofs which might be made out of reflective or very bright material. So they reflect more sunlight than they do absorb, instead of those dark surfaces that we would normally build them with. We can also consider things like green roofs or even green infrastructure or green buildings, which typically have some kind of integrated vegetation to them, right? And those also act in a cooling way, right? To cool down or perhaps absorb or transpirate some of that moisture. Another great example that serves lots of different benefits is blue-green infrastructure. Now, primarily, this is a nature-based approach to deal with stormwater, but it also helps with flooding, and it helps with water quality and biodiversity and urban heat. And so this is a really multi-purpose alternative for us. With these, we can increase our pervious surfaces, so the surfaces that can let water pass through. And we can help manage our stormwater, which is particularly important here in Christchurch. We're very prone to flooding. You may have seen some very great examples of blue-green infrastructure. They are littered around Christchurch, the newest of which you might see around our new stadium. So if you go and take a look, there's quite a lot of blue-green infrastructure, things called bioswales around our stadium. And of course, what we're going to focus on primarily today, one of the best ways for us to combat this urban heat, at least from an adaptation perspective, is to increase our green space and pervious surfaces with trees and tree canopy. And this is a simple but really highly effective measure for dealing with urban heat, since trees provide not only local cooling in the form of shade, obviously, but they also increase evapotranspiration, which provides an additional cooling effect. Luckily, we have a true expert here to talk to you more about Christchurch's approach to tree planting and canopy cover. So I will leave you in Toby's capable hands. Thank you once again for allowing me to introduce this topic, and I look forward to our further conversation.
Kia ora everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the introduction and the great example and explanation about urban heat. I'm from Council, I'm the Urban Forest Manager, so I'm going to quickly go over what trees do to mitigate heat, but it was actually quite well covered, so I've just got a picture that goes with what was just explained, which is quite nice. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our urban forest in Christchurch. So our urban forest is a term used to describe the collection of trees within our urban environment. So while I'm talking, urban trees and urban forests will be used pretty much as the same term. So trees, as was just explained, they have two really important roles for reducing heat island impact or urban heating. So we've all experienced the shade of trees. We all go and sit under them. They block that sun. They stop that heat getting into those surfaces underneath as well. And then through transpiration, where they actually cool their environment around them through the release of water vapour. So how does Christchurch rank, I suppose, or how does Christchurch look when it comes to our urban forest? So to measure our urban forest, we do what is called canopy cover surveys. So we look at the amount of the city that is actually covered by vegetation. For the purpose of these surveys, it was any vegetation over 3.5 metres because we were trying to capture those woody structures for trees. So we've had two surveys that have been completed in Christchurch. One that was based on 2015-2016 data, and another one that was based on 2018-2019 aerial imagery. As you can see, our canopy has dropped between those periods. It's important not to focus just on those percentages because the methods that are used vary a little bit every time we do a survey. The time of year when the aerial imagery was taken impacts how these surveys pick up trees. So there is a little bit of variance. So the earlier one actually overstated our canopy slightly, and then the next one that we did in 2018, 2019 underestimated it, but there was still a clear drop in our canopy cover. There's another survey that's on the way. I was hoping it would all be done when we came today, but it isn't quite finished. We've done most of the work. We're just checking the results as well. But there's another way we can check our canopy cover, and this is where we throw 1,000 points across the city, and what we do is we check those points to see if there's a tree or not. Now this method is actually quite accurate and quite reliable, to the point that when we do the full canopy cover survey in those reports, we actually check it against this method to see how reliable it is and whether it's within where we think it should be. So we use the same 1,000 points every time, so we know where they sit, and what we've seen is a reduction in our canopy cover. But what's also quite interesting or important to take into account is between 2015 and 2018, which was only 3 years, we had quite a big drop. There were a few reasons for that. We had the Port Hill fires and a few other things. But what we see between 2018 and 2025, whilst it's still dropped a bit, that drop over a longer period of time is a lot less. So we do feel like we're slowing that down, and I'm hoping that the next one will show an increase in canopy. It usually takes about 3 to 5 years for trees that we plant to show up on these surveys as well. So a lot of the work that we're doing now and over the last 5 years won't necessarily be showing up in those surveys, but they will start to come through as we go forward. So these numbers of percentage cover don't really mean a lot without context of where we should be. So we engaged the University of Canterbury to undertake a study looking at canopy cover across the world and where we think Christchurch should be based on the way things grow, the way the city's laid out. And they, based on internationally other cities around the world, they thought that our canopy cover should be around that 20%, which is what we're trying to aim for within our urban forest plan. So a result of these surveys and a lot of the work that we do, there's 2 documents that really try and push for us to increase our tree cover and protect the trees that are there, and those are the urban forest plan and the tree policy. The tree policy focuses more on the individual tree, but it's got a couple of things in there. It highlights when we're allowed to remove a tree, but it also requires us to plant 2 for every tree removed and to replace that canopy cover within 20 years. And then we've got our urban forest plan, which is really about trying to boost or increase that canopy cover across the city, but also ensure that it is resilient. So we know our canopy's low. We know we need to increase it. So what are some of the big challenges? Well, one of the biggest one is actually finding space. So as our city intensifies and we try and fit more on our road corridors, we do find it hard to fit trees in. There is a lot more pressure on that space, and as we try and develop our city and intensify, we will find it more and more difficult to include trees. However, it's not impossible. There are lots of cities around the world with greater populations than we have in Christchurch, and they still have greater canopy cover than we do. So there is ways to incorporate trees in. It's just shifting our thinking and ensuring that we do make allowance for trees to go in. And I think I'm going to end there and move on to the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Toby and Rebecca. It's fantastic to have you set up tonight's conversation. So everyone's coming on stage. This is our panel tonight. Joining Rebecca and Toby are Bridget Robilliard and tonight's conversation facilitator, Lianne Dalziel. Bridget Robilliard is a Ngāi Tahu landscape architect with over a decade of experience working in the private and public realm around Aotearoa. Having grown up around her marae at Taumutu, Te Ao Māori is embedded in Bridget's approach to landscape. Her mahi across a range of developments exposes her to the challenges and opportunities in providing canopy cover and green space. And facilitating tonight's discussion is Lianne Dalziel, CNZM, who describes herself as somebody who used to be a somebody. But we all know that she's so much more. Lianne served for 23 years in the New Zealand Parliament and for a further 9 years as the Mayor of Ōtautahi, Christchurch. Having represented an electorate that was hard hit by the 2010-2011 Canterbury earthquake sequence, Lianne has become a respected champion of resilience and a frequent speaker on post-data challenges and opportunities. Last year, Lianne graduated with a master's degree in international law and politics from the University of Canterbury. She also writes a fortnightly column for online platform Newsroom. So I'm delighted to hand it to Lianne, who will facilitate the conversation. Please welcome our panel.
Kia ora koutou katoa, and it's wonderful to be here and to be able to participate in another one of these excellent Christchurch Conversations. And what a great turnout. I thought, to be discussing urban heat on one of the coldest nights of the year was going to be, challenging. But what a great turnout, and thank you all for being here. And for those who are watching online, welcome to all of you as well. And I'm going to remind you that this is the number 022 565 8693 to text in any questions. So, Jessica's going to keep an eye on them as they come in. And if something, really is just that, needs an instant answer, then she's just going to stop me in my tracks and we'll move straight into some of the questions from the audience. So do that. And the same applies to people who are watching online. We're going to start off. I'm going to invite Bridget to respond a little bit to the quickfire talks, as she didn't give a quickfire talk, but I was just going to mention a couple of things. One, Toby, that last graphic that showed us like the 30% coverage in Wellington and the 13% in Christchurch, and it was kind of like, it just reminds us that we can't have a one-size-fits-all policy in New Zealand, especially around residential intensification, because we're a low, flat-lying city, and Wellington's got lots of hills and valleys, and that's why the densities are so different. But it highlighted for me just how significant the environment that we're discussing is. And don't you ever put your hand over your mouth and say, I'm an engineer. You should be screaming it from the rooftops. Over my time, I've discovered that engineers are wonderful problem solvers, and that is the essence of engineering, is understanding what the problems are and looking to work with others to find the solutions to problems. So don't you, I'm a lawyer, a politician and a lawyer, you can trust me. We create the problems is what the point that I was trying to make. But I'm going to hand over to you now, Bridget, and perhaps you've listened to the two, and would you like to throw in some thoughts of your own?
Yeah, kia ora, Lianne. They were both really interesting talks, thank you. And I thought it was so interesting growing up in Ōtautahi. We talked about how we were the garden city, but you actually look at our canopy cover compared to a lot of other cities, and we're really quite low down. But then when you think about the whakapapa of the whenua that we're on, when Rebecca talked about that blue-green infrastructure, you've seen the shift in how our landscape's dealt with, that there is a lot more of that coming online as well. It's an interesting consideration about how we deal with urban heat. I know some of the developments now, we put in these beautiful stormwater systems to deal with the problem, but actually they're some of the most valuable sections because people like that setting, but potentially there's also an urban heat consideration in with that as well.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to start with a question for all the panellists, And it's to reflect on where we are here in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. Where would you have experienced the urban heat island effect? So maybe if we start down the end there, Rebecca.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I have the wonderful fortune of living here in the CBD. So I live quite close to here, quite close to the library, just near the Margaret Mayhew playground. And where I notice the urban heat impact the most is in the central city. When I'm walking around, particularly in areas where there are very few trees, but when I'm walking around in our very, very central Christchurch, that is where our infrastructure is the most built up, where we have virtually no green space at all, and it's almost all entirely built infrastructure.
Toby.
Kia ora. I actually notice it when I walk down Gloucester past this building. There's these panels on the side of the building, and as you walk through, I don't know if anyone's experienced it on a hot day, but when you've got a sunny day, walk down there and you almost feel it hit you as you take about 3 steps and you get past it, and you get these waves of heat as you walk through, just because of the reflection of a couple of the panels on the building. They reflect directly onto that footpath area.
My answer is very similar. So I'm lucky that we work very close to the Ōtakaro. So most of my lunch breaks, I actually get the benefit of shade of trees. But then we've got all these lovely new buildings around the city, and a lot of them are very highly glazed. So the PwC building's an example for me that you come from quite a shaded area with the trees, and just where you hit that north sun exposure on the footpath onto asphalt, it's really noticeable just in that pocket where you don't have the shelter from anything there.
And I guess the converse, have you experienced the mitigation of urban heat in Ōtautahi or elsewhere in the world? We'll run back the other way.
So we've been lucky to work with Rickett and Bush Trust on Pūtahi Motu for the last few years, and it's always interesting. It can be a lovely sunny day, but if you're going out on site, you know to take a jacket, because when you get into the middle of the bush, it is noticeably different. Just being under that canopy cover and the moisture retention and things in there, it's a totally different microclimate.
Mine would be down Cashel Street through that mall section where you've got those large trees in the middle, and on a really hot day you almost feel like you've got to run between the trees, and you see everyone crowded under the trees, and unless they're at a shop, everyone will stop and wait under those trees when they're having conversations and avoid being in the sun.
Yeah, I was reflecting on this question and thinking, how do we think back to urban heat when we're in the middle of winter? But we still have an urban heat impact in winter. It's there. You just don't feel it as strongly as you do in summer. And so I was thinking about this the other day, and I bike to work from the central city over to the university, and I take almost a straight line, and I go right through Hagley Park. And on a very cold morning, the place where I feel the coldest is biking through Hagley Park, because there's no infrastructure there. It's nice and cool. It's right by a pond. There are lovely trees. And so that is my respite from urban heat, both in the winter and in the summer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm similar. I live in Cramner Square, so I've just got, the best example of how the city can be laid out with good green space and good urban living environments. Before we come to the question of increasing urban canopy, how do we best protect what we've got? You don't know what you've got till it's gone, and we've seen a lot gone, actually, those of you. So perhaps we'll start with you, Toby.
Yeah, protecting trees is actually really, really difficult. First, trees have a finite lifespan, so trees will never last forever. So retaining what we've got is almost about, as well as protecting what's there, making sure that we've got something to replace it. And I just had a conversation just before coming here with Nikki, who's in the crowd, and we were talking about when you remove a mature tree, it can take 30, 50 years to replace it. So actually what we've got to do is we've got to replace that tree 50 years before we cut it down. So we've actually got to be planting well in excess of what we've got. So we've got more mature trees coming through. And when that tree comes down, there's already one that won't be in the same location, but nearby, that is already reaching that maturity.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, that's a hard question to answer, even as an engineer. How do we protect what we already have? Yeah, I think that it's probably a really multifaceted answer that would be a good answer to that question. I really think that there's something to be said about recognizing how we live and where we live, and whether we're choosing to live in a natural environment with that natural environment, or on top of a natural environment against perhaps what was intentioned to be there. So I think that's a really big part of recognizing and protecting the diversity, the biodiversity, the trees that we have, and the environment that we live within here in Ōtautahi, but also across Aotearoa.
Bridget.
I guess lots of my mahi, we're working for developers, and so approach to trees can often be that they're an issue. So at the moment where we see existing trees being retained is typically only when they're a scheduled tree, which comes with a lot of complexities. Then, without that, often the site just gets wiped, and so you lose that existing tree canopy cover. So I guess it's finding that balance that you do find clients where if it's a tree of particular beauty or of some sort of amenity value that they might look to retain it, but otherwise at the moment there's no sort of balance between either a very strict set of rules that can really limit opportunities and ways to innovate around it, where you're working with a scheduled system, but then looking for something where there might be some incentivising around keeping the trees that are already on the site, because obviously those limitations also encourage creativity, and at the moment I think there's a bit of a gap in terms of encouraging people to not see them as a problem but an opportunity when working on a site where there's existing trees.
Yeah, I'm assuming that the audience understands the scheduling of trees, no, so we're seeing shaking heads. So, Toby, you're the expert on the job.
So a scheduled tree is, we've got our district plan and we have a list of trees that have a level of protection on them, and they're in a schedule, which is why they're called scheduled trees. The district plan, adding trees to that list is very difficult, to the point where it's almost not possible to do. So we haven't been able to add trees to there for a long time. There were changes to the RMA a few years ago which made it a lot stricter and a lot more stringent to have trees added to that list. So adding new trees is very difficult. So unfortunately the list that we have is almost a list that we've inherited and we've managed to keep going.
Can people put their own trees, nominate their own trees to be put on a scheduled list? Would that make it easier?
It should make it easier, but at the moment it requires an actual plan to change the district plan because it's embedded into the district plan.
But so presumably the council could invite residents who had significant trees to be able to put them forward for consideration in a single plan change that might be able to do them as a group. And I know that there's rules against that as well, but...
Yeah, so we were investigating that and going down that trail, but then the changes that were proposed for the RMA, we're going to change that again, and then there's been a lockdown of changes to the district plan now.
Sorry, I was just catching up with what I've missed out on for the last couple of years. Jess, have you got a question there?
Yeah, well, there's a question that relates to this matter of keeping what we've already got. So I thought we could throw it in here. Someone comments, before they ask a question, that the Kashmir Heathcote Spraydon Community Board recently voted to cut down a 35-year-old oak tree in a public park, apparently because a nearby resident who moved in after the tree was planted 35 years ago didn't like the shade. How do you get better decisions out of your local community board if that's what they're doing?
Well, again, Toby's probably going to be the one who's got... But don't blame him for the answer.
So I do understand the background to that. In the context of that small question, it doesn't sound great, but there were a lot of other large trees around it and another 2 trees will be going in, and we did plant a lot of other trees in that park. But council staff's delegation is we take care of the unhealthy trees and structurally unsound trees, so that comes to staff decision. Anything beyond that goes to the community board, and I would say the best way, if these are things that concern you, is go and talk to your community board, and when these decisions come up, ensure that you are there as well, so you can represent your opinion as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you. And well, I guess the next one I'm going to actually go back to you, Rebecca, if I may. And it comes back to the intensification requirements of our district plan. And the question is, can we do dense and green? I think you've talked about other parts of the world that are denser and greener. So what's different here?
Yeah, actually, Toby had a great slide that showed other parts even of New Zealand that are denser and greener than Christchurch. Yeah, it is 100% possible. Yes, this slide. There we go. Wonderful. So denser in terms of population and greener, at least in terms of canopy cover, that being both true across the world. So lots of examples from the United States, from Australia, and from the UK across there. So can we do it? Yes, absolutely. Why don't we have that situation in Christchurch? I think, again, it's probably a combination of things, but you mentioned earlier we're a low wide city, and that has actually quite a lot to do with how our urban fabric exists and how it was formed. And so we have this big sprawl across and this propensity for kind of medium density housing, and the housing that takes up quite a lot of a lot. And so little green space, maximizing your lot space, medium density housing, quite low to the ground. And we, as a city, for one way or another, have chosen to prioritize that. And so, yeah, can we get there? Yes, absolutely. But we would have to choose to prioritize things differently than what we have in the past.
And again, that comes back to the district plan rules, all of which are kind of in a bit of a no man's land at the moment because of the changes to the RMA that's coming. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, it does provide additional challenges.
Right, okay.
I would say probably market seems to be a driver as well for that. When we see, particularly, I mean, when I was studying, we got told you're probably not going to do much greenfield design, you'll be looking at intensification, but that's certainly not the case of what we're seeing in Canterbury. So we are taking areas that maybe weren't tree canopy covered, typically they were often pasture, but they're now going into smaller sections than they have been, with a relatively large one-storey coverage on it, and also the land type that we're going on to often in those developments is areas where we used to have wetland, so high water tables, getting a lot of engineered fill to then be able to build on that land that then isn't super supportive of being able to establish healthy trees on those sites.
So I hadn't thought of that. So the soil type that you would use for building up a site is not the same soil type that would be required for establishing new trees.
Yeah, so especially when we're going into a lot of areas where the ground would typically be quite soft and peaty, you're looking at a lot of engineered fill, which I'm sure the engineer could talk to a bit better, but it tends to be a lot more gravels and things. But then if you're also going onto a site where the drainage is quite poor, you tend to have water sitting there. And I think because there's not forethought of where trees are going at the time when that land development's happening, there's not the allowance going in to make sure that we're actually providing gardens that for the people who do want to establish those gardens, that there's good conditions to plant into. And so then it's limiting for people who do want to plant. You don't often think, well, actually I need to come in with an engineered solution where I excavate a long way, I might need some drainage. So I think there's some missed opportunity there in terms of allowing people who, as our urban, we move away from the quarter acre section, but people who still want to have those private gardens and have that canopy cover, how are we supporting that with what our current market demands and development processes look like?
Well, can we plant elsewhere, not just in private properties, but on the street berms and, the on the sides of roads. So, I mean, are there other places where we can plant, develop more green spaces, more community gardens, those sorts of things around communities?
Yeah, I know Toby's got some good studies on this, but I think from a professional, from the time that I've been working, I've definitely seen that as the section sizes get smaller, road reserves get smaller, you've got other considerations like visibility space for safety. It is continuing to limit how many trees you can actually get into public spaces like road reserve. And so then obviously the pressure comes on to some of those other public spaces to be able to provide that facility.
And retrofitting, of course, would be it'd be harder to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So trees need a lot of soil, a lot more than people often think. But the other thing is trees don't actually put their roots down as deep as people think either. So 90% of the roots are usually in around the top 600 mil of your soil. They very rarely go more than a metre down. So when you're looking at a tree and the amount of soil volume it actually needs quite a lot to support it through to maturity. And where we start to see a lot of these historic issues, it's actually the tree being put in a space where it doesn't have enough soil volume, so it has to break out of that space that it's been provided to survive, really. It's a bit like putting a baby in a toddler's clothes. It looks like it's got lots of space to begin with, but it soon outgrows it. So that's what we do with a lot of our tree planting, a lot of the historic stuff. We put in these really narrow booms, and then trees can't grow under roads. They shouldn't be able to because it's compacted hard fill, and tree roots can't actually penetrate into that hard fill. They do break up asphalt footpaths. So one of the reasons that occurs is, one, the asphalt footpath is a lot thinner, but you get a separation in the way these different materials shrink and expand, and that creates a small gap, which allow roots to penetrate through that gap, and then they'll expand. You also get some water condensing under these surfaces as well. So that's why we see a lot of that root damage in those footpaths and things. There are a lot of engineered ways to construct your footpaths past trees to try and prevent that from happening. But then we've got other issues such as services running through. Old services will be broken by tree roots. Tree roots don't actually have the ability to break new services. Believe it or not, they don't have the ability to lift a house, a new house, or any of those things. And they're not as malicious as some people may think, where they go, oh, if you plant that tree there, it's going to come over here and damage all of this. They don't actually intentionally go out to damage stuff. But where there is a gap, say there's a crack in a pipe, then they'll take advantage of that gap, and they will penetrate through that gap, and then as they expand, that's where we start to get those problems.
So maybe over to you, Bridget. What about, I kind of want to come back to this mitigation, that the housing development model that we've got, the sort of open to market building methodology. You may have the will and the space, but you won't have the right soil. You won't. How do we change? What needs to change that enables us to provide a better option to see? I just worry that these problems are going to be created and then we can't fix it after the fact, but we can get in at the front end.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it will come down to planning for it from the outset, which at the moment, so certain zoning in the city has a requirement for a particular amount of garden space or soft landscaping, and some of that has to be planting, but within that there's no requirement for trees to actually form part of that, and that's only in certain zones. So a lot of the areas where we're seeing a lot of development, some of the areas where we saw the suburbs where there's very low tree canopy cover is often where we are seeing a lot of that development happening as well, because it's obviously a lot more new housing, but also a lot denser. But at the moment, in those areas, there's not those planning requirements. And so, the land development happens based on an expectation of a lot size, but there's no consideration around what housing's going on, what balance there might be of garden versus floor space going in. And then with that, so with the road reserves, where we're looking to vest to council, there's some quite specific requirements that we need to look at in terms of how much soil volume we're providing, what size tree we put in. So it is possible, because we think about that at the time before the land remediation occurs, you can think about it, but on the private lots, there's no requirement to think about that, and so you sort of go for the standard approach. If there was some sort of incentivising or requirement that came through that meant that you had to consider tree canopy cover, I think that doing it from the outset so that you can make sure the right soil volume, any required drainage was going in, would mean that this new housing that we're developing is able to support establishing healthy trees and healthy canopies through those areas as well.
And I guess I kind of want to come back to the idea that we've got a number of these challenges, and they're restricted within the sort of regulatory frameworks that we've got. And I kind of want to come back to this idea of maybe we could build in some incentives, as opposed to, having this is what you can and can't do, the strict regulations. Is there something in the incentive space that either you or Toby would like to talk about?
I mean, I can comment on the incentives. I'm not a policy person, but I think incentives...
You're a problem solver.
I am a problem solver. And I like to think deeply about problems, about sustainability, about climate. I think one of the big issues that we face often for a lot of things, not just for urban heat, not just for trees and tree canopy, is that we are very good and we're very practiced at valuing things that have some money connection, like buildings or roads or cars. And we are very bad at valuing things that don't have that connection, like trees, that provide something like health benefits that are really hard to translate into money. Right? Or things like cooling effects for, particular parts of the population that are more keenly felt by older people and young people or people with pre-existing health conditions. That's really hard to translate into what we use, like financial incentives. So I think that's the hard thing to overcome with policy that puts us in that direction with those kinds of behavioral nudges. And we see that in things like tree cover and valuing trees, but all kinds of dimensions where we have that same kind of issue. And Toby probably has some more concrete policy thoughts on that, but...
Not concrete.
Not concrete.
The incentive thing comes up quite a bit. I think the challenge is, how do we ensure that those incentives are fair? I think it's widely published that lower socioeconomic areas have lower canopy cover. So if you start rewarding people for trees, then the people in those more affluent areas are going to receive a lot of those benefits. When we look at those lower socioeconomic areas, they're also usually the smaller sections as well. So they're the ones who struggle to put trees in. If we start to require them to have engineered surfaces for trees, they do cost more. So it ends up lumping it on the areas that are probably already struggling financially. So I hear the incentives. When I first came into the job, I was all for the incentives and trying to find ways of doing it, but I don't think it's as simple as going, if you have trees, then you're incentivized by rates caps, or reducing your rates, or not paying so much when you get a building consent and things like that, because the areas that really struggle to put trees in are not necessarily the areas that can afford those extra costs onto it.
That's very good. I'm just wondering whether, we've talked enough about retaining trees and maintaining them, because often people think that once you've planted a tree, then you've done your bit. We've all been on tree planting days and planted trees, but we haven't gone back and watered the trees and made sure that they were being looked after. And Toby.
So when we plant a specimen tree, for example, 50% of the cost of establishing that tree is actually watering. So the cost of purchasing the tree and planting the tree is only less than half of the cost. Most of that cost actually comes through going back and watering those trees, and it's going to be even harder. We've got quite a good tree planting program in Christchurch. I'm going to do a quick plug here because I've got 3 of the tree planting members here in the row, and they've managed to plant 3,000 trees this season.
Oh, well done.
And to put that into context, we've got around 60,000 trees, specimen trees across the city. So 3,000 new trees is a huge lift in what we were planting in the past, which used to be around 400. That's a quick plug. But yes, that maintenance and that aftercare is really critical. And that is the difference between an actual tree being successful and a whole lot of time and effort going into putting something in the ground. But yeah.
I know that we've been talking about, the heat island effect and all of the reasons why tree canopy is important. But what about nurturing a love for trees? I've reflected on this for this event about that wonderful program in Melbourne where they've decided to lift their tree canopy from 22%, I think, in 2012 through to 40% in 2040. Yeah, so they want to get to 40%. But they started off digitising really all of their trees. There's 70,000 trees, and they gave them all individual email numbers. Addresses rather, and so people were to send messages about branches that need cutting or various things that were wrong with. But actually, they ended up being love letters to trees. I met my wife under you, and it's what it's done is it's created this love of trees. I recommend you have a look at it. But is there more that we need to be doing to educate people about the significance of trees, and maybe, if you've got a tree in your own back garden, and you're looking out on a sea of properties that have got no tree, maybe you don't realise that actually it's impacting the whole city by not having the tree canopy that we require. So I'll just leave it open to any one of you to jump into that.
Yeah, I think the short and obvious answer is yes. It would be great if we had a greater love for trees. I think probably we have a little bit of a tainted audience for people who probably already love trees, who are sitting in this room. And maybe we need to work a little bit to think about how we branch out a little bit more and try to capture. Thank you. Yep. I love a good pun. And how we try to capture some people who maybe don't share that or just haven't even thought about it. It just doesn't cross their mind. They've got so many other things to think about and worry about day to day that they don't think about the cooling effect of trees and how amazing they are. And I think it's really true, like maybe we need to do a little bit of myth busting for trees, to Toby's earlier points of, we think we know all these things about how trees are and what we've seen from how we used to plant trees 40 years ago, and that's not quite true anymore. And there are some maybe truths that need to be shared. I really like the idea of love letter to trees, and if we could do that in Christchurch, that would be amazing. I don't know how we get that started, but petition to do that would be wonderful.
I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about raising people to love trees because my son is obsessed with chainsaws and just wants to cut every tree down. But I think when Rebecca talked about this monetising of things, like we often find, particularly when we're getting client briefings around where trees are positioned, like they don't want them too close to the house because there'll be leaf drop and gutters will block, and I don't want to be shaded in the winter and things. But as we see our climate shift, I think we'll also see benefits of reduced power bills over the summer because of shading. Our previous house, we were in a row of townhouses and we were on a section with the established trees that were there before development. and our neighbour didn't have that, and all his windows and doors were warped from catching so much north sun, whereas our framework was fine from not having that exposure. So I think there's been this very much mental thing around trees being a negative too close to our houses, but we may see as what the climate is that we're living in, considerations of the microclimates that they provide at different times of the year as actually being a benefit.
Well, that's really good. I think, Jessica, have you got some questions?
Some questions. There are so many questions.
Okay.
Many of them are excellent.
Excellent.
Some quick fire ones specifically for Toby, because there are a lot here about the canopy in particular. Which boundaries are used to assess the canopy cover? Obviously, it doesn't include Banks Peninsula.
Yeah, so it just didn't include the Banks Peninsula Community Board area, but all the other Community Board areas were.
Are you anticipating improvement in canopy cover largely from council planting only, or is the private sector contributing as well?
It is most likely going to be from council's contribution. Private is hopefully not decreasing much, but I don't think it's increasing nearly as fast as we need it to.
Why is 20% the goal? Is that just based on some international average, or are there benefits that come into play when the cover is over 20%?
Yeah, so there is an actual report that you can look up under Justin Morganroth. He's got a page on it and he's got the report sitting there. But essentially what they did was they looked at our, what they call biome. So they classed Christchurch as more of a grassland biome. And essentially the way he put it is, in your forested biomes, if you leave a little bit of ground, generally trees and vegetation will grow, where if you leave a little bit of ground in Christchurch, it ends up in dry grass. Part of that is the seed source, but it's also our climate. We've also got a very flat, easily developed area as well, but it was largely based on the biome, and when they compared to cities around the world and what it would look like and what Christchurch could try to attain to, it was that 20% cover.
Great, thank you. This question could probably also be answered by Bridget. We're focusing on trees, but in Ōtautahi we have many, relates to what you just said, Toby, many low-scale wetland and bushy ecosystems. Do they help reduce the effects of urban heat too? Actually, it's Rebecca as well. You can all answer that question.
Yes, although they don't provide all the same benefits as trees do. So Toby's very lovely image that he put up at the beginning of his slide showed this picture of a tree that has these two main benefits, one of them being shade and the other one being transpiration. Our shrubby grassland also provides transpiration to some extent and can help retain soil moisture, which also has additional benefits, but obviously often does not provide shade. So yes, but to a lesser extent.
Yeah, I probably don't have much to add to that, but apart from, I guess, I think when we think about what our city looks like and how it performs, those kind of landscapes do work really well for the kind of land we have. We do know that we used to have more canopy cover, so obviously Pūtahi is a remnant of what used to be here. Papanui Bush was still here at the time of European arrival. Areas like Hallswell at the moment where the development's going on, large matai stumps are being pulled up regularly that got knocked over when the Waimakariri, one of the flood events, came through. So I guess there is within that blue-green network that we are seeing, I mean, and council's done some amazing investment into some of those networks as well, which we're just probably starting to see get established now, but there would be opportunity within that to have different kinds of canopy covers, and particularly that sort of mixed native bush, which is going to become harder to have on private property, and is really important when we think about our biodiversity, our manu. You know, we've got, so Ōtautahi and Waihora are both quite amazing sources for ecosystem, for birds from all over the world, and our city is a flight path through that, and so there's other benefits as well of providing that range of ecosystems through those networks.
Great, thank you. There's a number of questions about what kind of tree, you know, the saying the right tree in the right spot. Are there trees that are less effective than others when it comes to urban heat mitigation? Are canopies better than just upright single trees? There's also a question that I can't find because you lot are sending so many questions about whether we should be planting more native trees because they're evergreens on the whole.
I guess to talk to that, our native trees typically are not well suited to being standalone specimen trees. When you look at the environments that they want to grow in, they do best when supported together. There are a few natives that manage to do okay. Some of them, like our Te come with other maintenance issues. So I think in terms of like biodiversity, habitat provision, yes, but in terms of right tree, right place, a lot of the spaces where we are looking to put trees in are already quite challenging. Obviously we're in quite a windy environment, and so these poor trees particularly go onto these greenfield sites and they're just out in the open getting hammered by the wind without any of their friends around them that they would normally have in the ngahere. So I think, yes, where it's the right tree in the right place, but there's definite benefits, especially as we get smaller as well. We're going with an exotic where you're deciduous, and it means we don't have the same shading effects as a real benefit in urban spaces too.
Cool. There are a number of questions about how we can better, other strategies we could use. What about retrofitting existing houses with green roofs? People are asking about the design of our city blocks, or other strategies for cooling buildings and houses. Do you have anything to add, Rebecca?
Yes, so much. There are so many cool examples, not just of how we can retrofit, but also how we think about further development. So we have this really kind of ingrained habit of doing this concentric development, which contributes to urban heat. Instead of thinking about, for example, our natural waterways and the previous environment that would have been in Ōtautahi before we developed, and how we can develop along those pathways instead of kind of developing on top of those pathways. There are some really interesting examples of blue-green infrastructure, or even just green infrastructure overseas. I'm originally from Canada, and there's some really great examples in some of the really dense cities in Canada. For example, in Vancouver, they have this mandate for green roofs in the city, where a proportion of all of the roofs in the central city of Vancouver have to have a part of their roof be a green roof. Now that's important in Canada because the temperature swing is really big. So we have a little bit of a temperature swing here between winter and summer. In Canada, that can be quite pronounced. So it can get quite hot in the summer and it's very humid, and it's also quite cold in the winter. And a green roof provides a double effect. So cooling in the summer and warming, insulating in the winter. So could it be something that we investigate? For sure. It does come with costs. There are also other things to think about. If you have a green roof, you obviously need to have a structure to be able to support a green roof. So there has to be a little bit of intention behind those kinds of things. I really like the examples of pervious infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure in a city. There's some really cool examples in Europe of, for example, grassed kind of like road infrastructure underneath of trails or trains or trams. So you'll have this tram line in a city, and underneath of the tram line is this big grassy field, and it's perfectly pervious. The water goes right through it. This really cool example of green infrastructure in the middle of a city. So yes, there are tons of examples, and that's just on the side of kind of blue-green and more on the nature-based solutions. And we obviously have some other more hard engineered types of approaches that we could also use to mitigate urban heat or to think about the design of our city.
Thank you. There's a kind of a follow-up question to that, remarking that we have lots of asphalt and obviously more permeable surfaces and less car parking and new roads, fewer new roads, could actively reduce our urban heat. How do you change the current culture of how we develop space? An easy question,
I
this
almost
one.
feel like Lianne might be the person who's had the most experience in the culture shift. Yeah, I think it is. And when we talked about the love of trees and things, I think it is. I mean, the city's so different now from what it was, you know, even when I started studying, which was just pre-quake, and it's pretty amazing to be back in a city centre where people actually walk places and it's alive again. And so you hope that as our culture shifts and evolves, that there might be, you know, some of that value set moves our society to where we aren't so reliant on private vehicles, and that we also see some infrastructure come in to support that shift away, where we can have lovely tram and lines with grass underneath them, rather than having you know, big empty lots that are just filled with cars that drive on asphalt to get there.
Thank you. How can we encourage or foster greater canopy equity?
I can jump in on that one. I think council probably needs to take a bit of a leading role in here, because of those inequities that I mentioned earlier. The areas that do have low canopy cover are generally areas that do have smaller lot sizes, smaller housing sizes, not the large gardens. So that is where council comes in, and we try and prioritise that type of planting in those areas. Through the planting program that we've done, what I've noticed is the areas with low canopy cover, they see the biggest change. So when we go in and we plant a lot of the park, there is a little bit of fear that comes with all of that change as well. So it goes from a nice big open park area that may not have a lot of trees, and we come in and we say, we want to fill in 50% of your park with trees. And there's a bit of that shock value in that change. We're noticing that shift starting to come through now, so a lot more of the plans are going through, a lot more are being approved. But that's as far as trying to balance that equity, trying to focus our planting program in those areas. But at the same time, we can't ignore the areas with the high canopy cover, because like I said earlier, the planting that we do, we need to be planting 20, 30 years before we come to removing these mature trees. So we need to make sure that there's mature trees in place to replace those as well.
Thank you. There are the questions. I must have. I'm overwhelmed. The questions are really good, and they are very, very many of them. There's a lot of questions about the role of the Ōtautahi river corridor, and whether that factors into the canopy improvement estimates. And whether or not it would actually make any substantial difference to the urban heat island effect.
Yeah, so it comes up a fair bit. Let's just plant all of that area and then we won't have any canopy cover problems, or our canopy cover will be lifted substantially and kind of job done. So a lot of the benefits that come from trees are location specific. So you're not going to get shade. If you're out in Hornby, you're not going to get shade from planting out in the east. So we need to ensure that that distribution of canopy is across the whole of the city and not in one location. But also, to put it into context, we looked at if you planted the whole of the Port Hills, that would only actually increase the city's canopy cover by around 1%. So increasing the canopy cover is actually quite a big task that needs to happen everywhere. Yeah. It's not a let's just plant trees in this one place and we'll get it, but the target is there because it's something that's easy for us to measure. But I think if we move away from the target and we start to look at the reason we want these trees, it's really about all those benefits that they provide to those people who are living around them. So it's more important to get trees well distributed across the city than to come up with an overall number.
Thank you. With increasing floods, sea level rise and thus groundwater rise, what are the likely effects on Christchurch trees in our canopy?
I can answer that one too. So Climate change is going to change things. Trying to figure out what species are going to cope with those future climates is challenging, because we're needing to plant something that's going to cope with our climate now, but also survive the climate that's expected to come into the future, which is not an easy task, particularly as there's a lot of variance in what that's going to be. Sea level rise, so salt water, some trees cope with it better, but we do have some areas where we've seen large swathes of trees die, where we've had saltwater inundation. So ensuring that we know when that's going to happen and planting things that will cope with those sorts of environments is important. Changes to wind, changes to heat, changes to water, it all plays its part. There are some species that we're starting to plant less of, and we're starting to try and find other varieties that we know will do better. We've got a lot more data on a lot of our exotic trees as opposed to our native trees from around the world. And there's some really good databases that we can refer to try and ensure that the stuff we plant. But again, it's trying to find something that will cope with today's climate, but also survive the climate in the future. And a lot of the things that we go, okay, they'll survive those really hot, dry temperatures aren't necessarily what we've got now.
Cool, thank you. And huge thanks to our audience who asked an incredible number and very high quality questions. Apologies we couldn't get to them all, but they were superb.
It was great. And I mean, just given some of the answers that we've heard to those questions, I mean, there are things that it's brought up for me that I'd like to sort of explore further, but you know, we don't have the time. And I just wonder whether we could gather those questions, the rest of the questions together, and perhaps submit them to our panellists, and if some of us have got time, to you know, to provide some of the, you know, some thoughts on them as opposed to answers, then that might be quite useful to people that have come here tonight.
Yeah, we can certainly offer them out and see how we go.
Yeah, that's great. So I've just got one more question, and I guess it's in a way there's something within me, certainly a frustration about what you can do sort of up against it, as it were, and so that's really my last question is what would be your advice, each of you individually? What would you be your one piece of advice, something that you wanted to leave with this audience and the wider audience that's tuned in? What would be that one piece of advice, or what would you want the audience to leave knowing something in particular, or what would you want to say to the elected leaders of the city, except for you, Toby, because of course I know you can't, but something that you'd like to leave, a little gem for everyone who's here. I'll start at the end of the row.
Ugh, give me the hard job.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a tough thing to say. What's the one takeaway you can take from this huge conversation with such a diverse panel? I think for me, as a researcher and as somebody who works at the university, I do think quite a lot about education. I'm a very curious person. I think probably a lot of people in the room sit in that space as well. But I really like Toby's comment about, if this is something that you're really passionate about and it affects you in your local area, the best thing that you can do is get involved. And so if you have the time and the brain space to do that, I think that's one of the best things that you could choose to do with your time. You can also try to use your feet, so vote for the people who support the issues that you care about, and make sure that your voice is heard as much as possible. So I think that's what I would take away.
Toby?
Mine's pretty simple, plant a tree. If you can, plant one on your property, or plant one if you've got a local church, a local school, or a friend with a big yard. Try and get those trees planted outside of the spaces that would regularly get trees. So we've got planting programs and things for council that will happen. Trees will go there. Still get involved in council, come to planting days. It's always great, be involved. But the biggest impact will be putting those trees outside of that public land wherever there's space. A lot of people don't have space on their own property, but they might have a friend who has a bigger yard to try and encourage them to plant a tree, or a local community or somewhere like that.
could council help if somebody wanted to go to their local church and say, we'd like to plant some trees there? Would council be able to provide advice on the type of tree and things like that?
Absolutely. We've got some really good material online, but you can always give us a call as well, and we can give you some advice on the types of trees to plant, the things to look out for when you're planting a tree, getting a tree from the nursery. You'll probably get a long-winded arborist answer about trees. We're pretty used to that. But in general, what I've noticed is even the stuff that I hate to say it, the stuff that I say, don't plant that, it'll never survive, I see it surviving. So, I mean, the best thing you can do is just find something, get it in the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you.
I guess to build on that, I'd just say if you are in a space, particularly in a design space or something related, plan for trees as an asset along with your house and your roof type and your driveway. The earlier you plan it, the more opportunities you have to integrate it and have a successful thriving tree, but also then a nicer environment for you to get to enjoy earlier on as well.
So on that note, could I ask you to join with me and thank Rebecca, Toby and Bridget for their wonderful contribution. And I will hand back to Jessica.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you all so much. That was fantastic. And thank you all for your excellent questions. Phew, a bit overwhelmed. As we usually do, we end with a poet, and we're very fortunate to be able to welcome a poet at all tonight. Tonight's scheduled poet, Tan Wright, is unfortunately ill, and we wish them all the best for a full recovery. Stepping in at the last minute is a good friend of Te Pūtahi, and a familiar face at Christchurch Conversations, Erik Kennedy. Erik Kennedy is the author of the poetry collections Sick Power Trip, which was published last year, Another Beautiful Day Indoors from 2022, and There's No Place Like the Internet in Springtime from 2018. He co-edited No Other Place to Stand, a book of climate change poetry from Aotearoa and the Pacific in 2022. He is the poetry editor of Tākahe and an adjunct fellow in English at the University of Canterbury. Please welcome Erik.
Kia ora koutou katoa. So when I was asked to read tonight, sort of at the last minute, I realized that I think I have a really suitable poem about urban heat to open with. The only problem is that I don't think it's really ready. But I'm going to do it anyway, because why, you know, it's conversation, it's the discourse. So it's a poem that came about when I read an article last year about some of these new builds in the city centre and how they're just ovens when the sun is beating down in them. Like, you cannot live in them. So it's a poem called The New Townhouses. The new townhouses hit 50 degrees inside on 20-degree days. That's hot enough to talk about frying an egg on the floor while actually getting heat stroke. What would you do with an egg you fried on the floor anyway? A forlorn floor egg with its memories of dust and dead skin. The heat stroke is the more interesting problem. The heat stroke is where the personal meets the political, where thermoregulation and building regulations are brought into the same space and not let out. The issues are kept in by big, unopenable, floor-to-ceiling windows that look clean and premium in the rendering and really let you take advantage of the late light that saturates this locale in summer. If you threw a single brick through a single big unopenable window, you'd be enacting individual change and not system change. And you're the kind of thoughtful person who, when presented with the facts, goes away to edit your life. And then, in the middle of lunch or a conversation, up and says, "Right, how many bricks and how many windows?" Thank you. And to finish, one that's maybe less revolutionary in character, but is still about a hot city, this city, in fact, and sort of how we deal with urban heat. I'm a seaside guy, so it's a going to the sea poem. It's called Pacific Sea Surface Temperature Anomalies. No, that's not how it starts. It's hotter than Venus, so everyone goes to the beach. As sure as city traffic stops at a T, or a $30 cocktail has too much ice, the clammy, suffering people go to the sea. As sure as an asshole tells a girl to smile, as sure as unbaptized kiddies go to limbo, as sure as cheap jeans stain your legs, as sure as Russian oligarchs fall out windows, as sure as a cooking blog is full of ads, as sure as a sheriff fancies lethal force, as sure as writers lie about reading Joyce, as sure as ashwagandha tastes of horse, as sure as carbon credits are underpriced and dignity is expensive and love is free, the clammy, suffering, sweltry, cynical, burnt out, downhearted, vulnerable people go to the sea. Thank you.
And that is why we end with a poet. Thank you so much, Erik. That was such a treat. You're leaving us laughing, not just crying or worrying. Thank you so much to everyone who's been on this stage tonight, leading this Christchurch conversation to expand our knowledge on urban heat and ways to mitigate heat and its effects in Ōtautahi, perhaps by planting a tree and going to the beach. Thank you, Dr. Rebecca Peer, Toby Chapman, Bridget Robilliard and Lianne Dalziel and Erik Kennedy. If you want to revisit this conversation or share it with others, you can find it on our YouTube channel. Be sure to sign up to our newsletter from our Te Pūtahi website and follow us on social media. Thank you again to the series sponsors who have made He Whakawhiti Kōrero Christchurch Conversations possible. This year, Christchurch City Council and the New Zealand National Commission for UNESCO. The next Christchurch Conversation is on the 15th of September and is called Urban Naturing. It actually is a nice extension from tonight's topic. It focuses on the powerful question, is having a relationship with other living things in the urban environment key to unravelling the polycrises we face this century? You can book now on our website. Thank you all for coming tonight. These conversations are only given potential and impact by you leaving here charged with a sense of what you, your whānau neighbours, and us as the residents of Ōtautahi can do to address our overheated future. Pō Mārie, see you next time.